It's a nice, diverse crowd. To be honest, I'm a little surprised to be here this morning for two reasons. Number one, I got food poisoning, thanks to So Young. And I spent 2 days on death's door recovering from this. Started to bounce back last night watching the Celtics win that game by a lot, so pretty happy about that. So I'm happy to be alive. Secondly, here's what I know about digital. I know it's not analog, okay? So analog, fortunately I've got an Apple Watch, so I can still get little hands that go around the dial so I can tell time. Digital, I guess, is numbers that replaces analog. So why you've got me here so young to give this opening address, I think I finally figured it out. I'm the opening act to Sandy Pentland because he really knows this stuff. So I'm like the warm-up, so don't expect a lot of substance from me. You're gonna get that from Sandy. So my little talk has got 3 parts. There's an audience participation part, kind of warm the crowd up. Then I'm going to set some cultural context, which is very different than the context set by Ingrid. I hadn't seen that video before, but that's kind of a nice thing to play off of. And then I'm going to have some casual ruminations on topics that I'm involved in a little bit, some a lot, some only beginning, as to what I think this Global Center for Sustainable and Digital Finance must do. So I said it's a diverse crowd. Let's do the audience participation part. How many people in this room are Republican? Okay, 2 brave people. That's good. That's good. They're a little bashful, you know, they're kind of sheepish about it. That's okay. How many people in here know a Republican? That's good. You know, it's about half of you. So you're not living completely in a California bubble, like my Massachusetts bubble. Like, you know, it's kind of hard to find Republicans in Massachusetts. Third audience participation question. How many of you are up to speed on the US ESG culture wars? Oh, not too many. You don't know what fun you're missing. So everybody knows what ESG is, right? Environmental social governance. It was this boring thing. Nobody really knew what it meant a long time ago. And it's like, okay, it's like philanthropy. It's a transfer payment. No. Research shows over the long term, you manage material risks and opportunities. It contributes to shareholder value creation. Somehow, this got captured by the lunatic right in this country as this culture war where it's astonishing to watch. I mean, Ron DeSantis is running for president on an anti-woke, anti-ESG agenda. It's never clear to me what woke means, except it's a pejorative term for people like you, except for the 2 Republicans, liberals and progressives and things like that. It's been described in some House hearings by the Alabama Attorney General and the Utah Attorney General as this cabal of global elites forming horizontal agreements to basically undermine America's energy sector, make consumers pay higher prices. 21 red state attorney generals have sent letters to asset managers demanding what they're doing with this, quote, ESG. Former Vice President Mike Pence said it's a pernicious progressive strategy for accomplishing political and social objectives that they couldn't achieve at the ballot box, okay? And the volume that's going on this is astonishing. It gets better. There's a guy in North Dakota named Bill Tveet. I wrote a piece called Bill Tveet Should Run for President in the Republican Primary. Why do I say that? Bill was quoted in a local North Dakota newspaper saying, ESG is a human-organized satanic cult violating the laws of God. I shit you not, okay? I mean, he's on record, and I'm thinking, you know, you're my man, because it's like, okay, it's one thing to say it's a pernicious strategy, progressive. Let's get to the root of the problem. It's a human-organized satanic cult violating the laws of God. You're my man, okay? You guys are going to vote for him. You know, I want you to kind of mobilize some support. So I've been writing about this, and I wrote a little piece last summer called Grift Capitalism, the GOP's brilliant strategy for ripping off ordinary Americans. It was great. It's a takedown of Mike Pence and Vivek Ramaswamy and this and that and the other thing. I get an email from a friend of mine named Dan Crowley, who's a lawyer at K&L Gates in DC. He's a Republican. I've known him for a long time. Goes to your pub. Read your piece. I'm disappointed. Quite frankly, it's beneath you. He said, why are you adding fuel to the rhetorical fire? Why are you going to try and piss off Kevin McCarthy when he's going to be the next Speaker of the House? Turned out a little bit harder than we thought. He's good friends with Kevin. And he said the Supreme Court isn't rogue. Because I called the Supreme Court rogue over Roe v. Wade and EPA and the New York gun laws. I wrote back, I said, dear Dan, thank you for your note. I didn't start this fight, right? I didn't launch off this, you know, ESG is this pernicious strategy, blah, blah, blah. I said, Kevin doesn't know me. If he did, he wouldn't like me. And let's put the Supreme Court aside and let's have a conversation. So we get on the phone. Dan goes, Bob, I think sustainability is absolutely fundamental. Capital markets have a role to play, but he says, Bob, you have to understand, if you say sustainability to a Republican, they think AOC, Green New Deal, Europe, notice how I'm going to the left, Marxism, and they don't like it. I said, well, I actually don't really think about it that way, but you know, if that's kind of how you folks think about it, you know, I kind of get it. So we said, look, this thing is kind of getting out of control. You've got the left making claims about ESG that are unwarranted. You've got funds greenwashing saying, you know, here's this fund that's going to solve climate change. What's in the fund? A bunch of fangs. Has nothing to do with climate change, okay? So you've got the sustainability Taliban. I've written about the topology of hate for ESG. I was a pure math major at MIT. I remember the topology of hate for ESG. The super left doesn't like it because it's not true sustainability, because for them all ESG is factoring in material risk factors that contribute to value creation, and they don't care about value creation because they want to save the planet. I get it. Then the flat earthers, they don't like it because it's all the stuff that I talked about. And you've got this just sort of rhetorical noise going on and on and on about ESG. So Dan and I said, look, let's try and take this down to the fundamentals. So we wrote a piece in the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance called Turning Down the Heat on the ESG debate, separating material risk disclosures from salient political issues. And that's really important. And when I listen to things that come out of Europe, I see that there's a confounding in my mind between the material issues and salient political issues from a US context, not from a European context. Europe's got their Green Deal, they've got their taxonomy, they've got all the things they're doing. I'll talk a bit more. They've made a bet on this transition. I'm dubious it's going to move capital. What you've got in Europe, everybody's basically kind of accepted and doubled down. As Ingrid was talking about their sustainability, we've got to have all this money that's going to go into these opportunities. Here, there's this question, and it's a really important question, because when you put the crazy shit aside, you know, the satanic organized cult, the fundamental question that's being addressed, and you're getting that in the attacks on GFANs, which is what is the role of the public sector and what is the role of the private sector, and what is appropriate to expect out of the financial sector to contribute to sustainable development. Look, I'm all in favor of sustainable development. I'm a pretty left-wing guy, but asset managers, asset owners, there's this thing called fiduciary duty. They've got to produce long-term returns. And so whether they are contributing to a better world or not has to be put in the context of the rules that exist, of the laws that exist around fiduciary duty of pension fund trustees, fiduciary duty of asset managers, fiduciary duty of companies. And I think what we're seeing in this country right now is there's a lot of overheated and kind of silly rhetoric. And some of the stuff you read, I mean, it's just so silly. It's like every week I turn around, some congressman, some hearing has taken place. I've got a column on Forbes.com, so they say something crazy. I write something snarky. I have to admit, something I learned from a good friend of mine at KKR named Ken Melman, who explained to me the codependence between the New York Times and Donald Trump. It's like they both need each other. I have a codependence on the anti-ESG brigade. It's like if they disappeared, what am I going to do? What am I doing with all my time? All these fun columns I get to write, these snarky little pieces, you know, that I send around. It's like, what am I going to do with my time? Do I think this is going to last? No, I don't think it's going to last for a bunch of reasons. They're passing these bills in these red states that are basically deleterious to their own citizens. Indiana passed this bill that's going to cost their pensioners $6.7 billion a year over 10 years. I mean, the stuff is nuts. If you listen to this House hearing that was a couple weeks ago, you've got the Republicans talking about global elites and horizontal agreements. And you got the Democrats from, you know, places like Vermont and California talking about freedom and capitalism and information. It's like, what's gone wrong with the world? When the Democrats are in favor of freedom and capitalism, it's like, wow, it's all topsy-turvy. I'm a child of the 60s. If you would have told me this was going on when I was 18, 19, I thought I was having a bad flashback or something like that. You know, it's like, this can't possibly be real. So I've launched my little GOP outreach campaign, and it's very interesting. When you get beneath the crazy stuff, there's my friend Dan Crowley. We've written a piece in the Harvard Business Review called "In Rescuing ESG from the Culture Wars." There's a guy named Tim Doyle at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We've done a webinar, a couple webinars together. We wrote a piece on this Department of Labor ruling. It's kind of arcane. You probably didn't follow it. That has to do with ERISA, fiduciary duty. The short version of it is that under the Trump administration, the word was pecuniary. And when Biden changed it, it was economically relevant factors. Boy, to me, it's a distinction without a difference, because you can read into pecuniary and economically relevant factors whatever you want. But what you get is the language goes like this, and the political rhetoric goes like this. The Republicans pass something, the Democrats freak out. The Democrats pass something, the Republicans freak out. So I'm like trying to get to the root of what all this is. And a lot of it is about materiality, and it's about data, and the digital part will come in. Met this really interesting guy named Eli Lair. He started something called the R Street Institute. If you look at his background, he's pretty right-wing, some of the places he's been in. Wrote a very nice piece about kind of the biggest thing that happened under Trump was the separation of the GOP from big business. It was like a 150-year marriage, and it's kind of this messy divorce they're going through. So when you put these ESG culture wars, I think, in this context of the polarization that exists in this country, which is unfortunate, it's sort of entertaining. Do I think it's really fundamental in the end? No, I don't think it's fundamental in the end. I think 2 years from now, you know, this is going to be the pony that I'm riding. You know, I probably don't. All right. Then I met a guy named Rich Powell, who's with an organization called ClearPath. It's focused on climate change. There's something called the Conservative Climate Caucus, 84 members focused on climate change. There's a guy named Greg Goff. Long story how I met him. He was put on the board of ExxonMobil through the Engine No. 1 campaign. If you're familiar with that, I knew about this campaign before it launched because I know the people at Engine No. 1 and at CalSTRS. And so when Mike Pence wrote this op-ed letter to the Wall Street Journal in May, he goes, when he's talking about the pernicious progressives, and he says, Engine No. 1 They're in San Francisco, so you get that. I mean, they're in San Francisco, pernicious, bloody hedge fund in San Francisco. Even the hedge funds are pernicious progressives in San Francisco. Put 3 environmentalists on the board who are undermining the company from within. Holy shit, they're undermining the company from within. Who are these people? Oh, by the way, Exxon's market cap, while they've been on the board, has gone and reached a market high. One of these people, who I've gotten to know quite well, did an interview with him, is named Greg Goff. Who's Greg Goff? Career executive of ConocoPhillips, CEO of an oil and gas company, Republican, lives in Texas and gives a lot of money to the Republican Party. The lack of connection between the rhetoric and the reality in this stuff is astonishing, right? He thinks climate change is like a fundamental issue that we need to deal with. My progressive friends, I think, tend to too easily dismiss conservatives who have a different approach to climate change. And there's things like GFANs that are holy scripture in my crowd, and they're like the devil himself in the other crowd. And I think we need to get beyond that. So that gets to some ruminations of things going on in the world that are important and they're complicated. And somebody that really knows what digital is, other than it's not analog, this is something you folks can work on. SASB, ISSB, CDP, IRC, FRAG, GRI, CRD, SFDR, you know what all those acronyms are? What? Mention what? No. GRI. What's ERC? TCFD. Yep, CSRD. So good. All of this stuff is around reporting, right? It's around reporting. So if you look at financial reporting, which we take for granted, we didn't always have standards. They came about when the SEC was formed, long story. And for the longest time, for sustainability reporting, it was basically the efforts of NGOs. There was something called the Global Reporting Initiative, started by some friends of mine. I was the founding chair of something called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. There's the International Integrated Reporting Council, which I was involved in founding. There's the TCFD, which is the Bloomberg-Carney thing. CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project. Something really important happened 2 years ago, because the narrative had been all the sustainability reporting should be voluntary, and we're not going to pick the winners. We're going to let these NGOs go out there and market forces will sort it out, which is bullshit, right? You don't get standards through market forces. We didn't get financial accounting standards through market forces. It was regulation. So a group was formed called the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is part of the IFRS Foundation, which is as the International Accounting Standards Board, which does IFRS, which is International Financial Reporting Standards. Now they've got a group that has been tasked with developing standards for sustainability reporting. They can develop standards, they can't mandate the standards. That will be up to jurisdictions. Countries will have to decide. They've issued 2 provisionary standards. One is the general requirements, one's on climate. The SEC, as you probably know, they've issued their climate reporting proposal. It's being caught up in the culture wars. It'll be litigated. A lot of debates about scope 3. At our meeting yesterday, we talked about scope 3. Then there's something called EFRAG, European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, which has got the Financial Reporting Board, which basically is a good housekeeping seal of approval on IFRS, which the French regret because the French think they should have been in charge of accounting standards in the first place. So you're seeing European politics play out with this EFRAG and this guy named Patrick de Comberg, who's in charge of the Sustainability Reporting Board, and the vice chair is a smart German woman named Kirsten Lopata. They've issued 12 standards. And there's a big debate in here between so-called single versus double materiality. And that gets into this issue of what is the role of the private sector and what is the role of the public sector. The Global Reporting Initiative, which is the first NGO in this space, they were basically double materiality. It wasn't language that was used, but essentially they defined materiality as positive and negative externalities created by what a company is doing. Versus single materiality, which is kind of what the definition is for financial reporting, in essence, is it's something that investors would care about. So ISSB is doing single materiality, and when the consultation was put out there, the hue and cry on this was amazing. People went nuts, okay? The sustainability Taliban crowd, they went nuts. It's like, no, single material is not enough. We're not going to save the world through single material. I'm thinking, look, that's not their job. That's not the job of the ISSB. Their job is to come up with investor-relevant information. As investors decide things are material, dynamic materiality becomes so, then they'll kind of pick it up. Europe, if they want to have companies report on double materiality, in other words, things that are making the world a worse place, but either because of the lack of pricing of that issue or investors don't care for whatever reasons, they're a government and they have the right to do it. And you've got then the GRI and the guy that's the CEO of that guy. You've now got these bodies. You've got the ISSB developing its standards. You've got FRAG developing its standards. You've got the SEC is going to come out with whatever rule it comes out with. And you've got the GRI, which has been basically in the double materiality game for a long time. These are all hitting over the next couple of years. And the burden and the confusion on companies is astonishing. I know the woman who's in charge of sustainability reporting at Unilever, called Liz Angray. She came up through financial reporting. So they're pretty sophisticated. They want to do the right thing. They're very transparent. She's saying, how are we going to deal with all of these different reporting requirements, which essentially are going to become mandatory? Even if they aren't passed by regulation, which isn't going to happen in this country, broadly speaking. Investors are global. They want to see this information comparable across companies in different industries. So with some people at the ISSB and with Kirsten at FRAG and with this guy Ilko, we're working on a paper, little paper. It's not an academic paper. I don't really do academic papers anymore unless I've got smart people like So Young. What I do is I write snarky little pieces about the ESG culture wars. But you know what? I'm 72. I can do whatever I want, to be honest. So good luck to the rest of you. Go do your research. If there is a way to use digital technology to increase interoperability across these different standards, it's a big deal. I don't know if it can be done. I don't know how it can be done. It's a very big deal. Because what you'd have to do, it's like getting to the digital domain, so I don't really know it because it's not analog. But you look at what the common data elements are that are underneath, and you look at how they're defining, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Is it just the greenhouse gas emissions protocol? Is it something different? And if you could find ways to either identify the common elements or map from one to the other, that would be an enormous contribution. Because although work is being done, it's going to be political. The standard setting world is just kind of filled with angst and turmoil. And if you look at financial reporting, it's never cleanly done. So FRAG's going to bang along, and GRI is going to bang along, and the ISSB is going to bang along, and the SEC is going to bang along. And it's all important. And it's a big deal that this has changed from market forces to essentially we're saying, if we're going to take sustainability seriously, starting with value creation, then we need to have standards so that people are going to have investors the information that they need. But again, we need to distinguish between, what are these standards that are going to be about material value creation on a company side and those things that make the world a better, worse place. And I don't have time to get into this, but when you look at it from a universal owner perspective, it's a fair comment to make to say, well, there's things that the companies are doing that are making the world a worse place. And if I'm a universal owner, then I care about that, even if it's not material in kind of a value creation sense. But that's we're not quite there yet in the ESG culture wars. So one idea is to see if there's a way, and because the time is now. These are going to come out over the next couple of months, and then companies are going to be struggling with how they sort of adhere or comply to all of these different standards. The second thing, so I know a lot about this world. I've been in this world for a long time. The second thing I know a little bit about, the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, SFDR in Europe. This is all part of the Green Deal. And the thesis behind it is that we're going to move capital towards sustainable development. That's what Ingrid is talking about. So we're going to have this green economy. We're going to make the planet greener. It's good. But we're going to do it through this Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. And they're so-called Article 8 and Article 9 funds. Short version is Article 8 funds are light green funds. Article 9 funds are dark green funds. A light green fund is where you're doing ESG integration in the fund. So you're taking account of sustainability issues for value creation. A dark green fund is one where the explicit purpose of the fund is to contribute to sustainable development. Could be an environmental thing, could be a social thing, and that if these funds are labeled in this way, capital will move, and asset owners can choose to put their capital into, whatever they want to. Asset managers don't decide where the capital goes. They follow the mandates of the asset owners, although there's a lot of greenwashing, as I said earlier. This is really complicated. The rules on SFDR keep changing. It gets political. Is nuclear count for Article 8 or is it not count for Article 8? The data that you need to assess whether a fund is Article 8 or Article 9 basically has to come from the company, because you're looking at the portfolio holdings in this fund, but they came out with SFDR before they came out with CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So they kind of got it backwards, right? So until we've got these reporting coming from the companies, according to FRAG, then it's very difficult to know whether an SFDR is really an 8 or a 9 fund. So I think same issue here. If there was a way to use sort of digital technology to assess what these holdings are in Article 8 or Article 9 funds, then I think that would be a big contribution, because you're seeing just all kinds of chaos going on as these funds keep getting reclassified. So that's another area to think about. Last one I can be brief on, because I know virtually nothing about it, starting to do some research with Phil Young, is infrastructure. Sandy said something at our little internal meeting yesterday, which kind of, in my food poisoning fog brain, sunk in. I think it was a power plant in Pakistan. So if you look at infrastructure, a lot of sustainable development requires infrastructure. Investors would like to do infrastructure because if you can get it right, it's pretty stable long-term cash flows. Where are you going to access the funding for this infrastructure? I think the supply, from what little I know, the supply, Michael would know this better than me, I think the supply isn't kind of what the demand would be. But what I think would be interesting would be, is there a way to use digital technology to give retail investors access to infrastructure projects? Because there's a lot of retail money out there. And in a formal way, it's the same thing as giving investors access to private equity. I'm pretty involved in private equity. I chair something called KKR's Sustainability Expert Advisory Council. And one of the criticisms about private equity is that it's only available to the wealthy and then the big pension funds like, CalPERS and CalSTRS. I think you can make in similar ways an argument about infrastructure is that, retail people don't have access to something that can produce really quite stable cash flows over the long term. So if there was a way to use digital technology to tap into the retail base, then I think that would be a good thing. So let me wrap it up. Like I said, I'm the opening act. This is just to kind of make sure you're paying attention, get some coffee, digest your roll. I'm going to turn it over to Sandy. Europe is going in one direction, really double down on sustainability. US is in a culture war, which in the short term will pass, but in the long term, this question, which is not being adequately addressed by my crowd, to be honest, what is the role of the public sector? What is the role of the private sector? This narrative that we've had of The public sector is failing. The private sector's got to step it up. That's probably more kind of hope than reality. So I think we need to just be candid and address that. And then Asia's this huge dynamic economy. In Africa, countries I don't know, where things are in the very, very early stages, and kind of how all that sorts out, I really don't know. But the culture wars and this fundamental question, I think we can't ignore. I think the center can't ignore, because the US is the largest capital market in the world. We've got 60% of global market cap. So things that happen here, for better or worse, have consequences around the world. And so I'm a big fan, of a lot of the work that's being done in Europe. I've got some skepticism about it, but I think we also need to kind of take account of, there is this backlash, and it looks crazy in a lot of ways, and it is on the surface, but I think there's some fundamental issues in there about the public versus the private sector that we need to address. And with that, thank you very much.